Greetings collectors and welcome to today's retro game review. Back in the 90s, Sega was dominating the arcades with its landmark Virtua Fighter series. Now known and loved across multiple platforms, it's instantly recognisable. A game that you may not be so familiar with though is one of Sega's follow-up in-house titles, Last Bronx. An altogether different take on the polygon fighting genre that really came of age in the 90s. In the West, the game went largely unloved upon release, although it has now gained a retrospective following. However, it was a smash hit in its home country of Japan from day one. Join me today as we discover what makes Last Bronx different and why it polarises player opinion to this day. It's worth opening the Last Bronx story with a look at the state of the Sega Saturn in the mid-90s. Whilst the Sega Saturn is best known for its outstanding Japanese 2D sprite shooters such as Layer Section, Parodius and the Darius series, the Saturn also put up a strong offering in the fighting game genre. By 1996, the Sega Saturn was awash with fighting games and really had you covered no matter what type of fighting game you wanted. There was a whole range of slick 2D sprite arcade offerings in the way of King of Fighters and Fatal Fury. If you preferred a more accessible entry into 2D fighters, Capcom had you covered with games such as the Vampire Savior series, numerous Street Fighter editions, X-Men games, Marvel, Street Fighter vs Marvel crossovers. Then other studios such as Human delivered games such as Blazing Tornadoes, and there was Dragon Ball Z for the anime crowd. Need a martial arts polygon fighter? The Saturn had you well covered there too. There was Virtua Fighter, Virtua Fighter Remix, Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Fighter Kids, Virtua Fighter Kids Java Edition, no really, that's a thing, Fighting Vipers, Fighters Megamix, and Dead or Alive. Then there were the alternatives such as weapons-based fighter Toshinden. There were boxing and wrestling simulators in the way of K1 Legends series. There were the pre-rendered fighters such as Battle Monsters, Ragnagard, and of course, Fist. It's fair to say that towards the end of 1996, the Japanese Sega Saturn was a very well-stocked machine indeed. So, how to stand out from the crowd? That's where Last Bronx enters the ring. Up to this point in time, Sega fans were well covered for the 2D fighter genre in the way of the outstanding lineup of Capcom titles. In the polygon fighter corner, Virtua Fighter ruled the roost. What was missing was a decent weapons-based fighter. Sure, games like Soul Blade and Toshinden had already begun to make their mark, but here in the West there was somewhat of a lukewarm reception at the time. If you owned a Sega Saturn, Virtua Fighter 2 was the hottest ticket in town. Plug in your HSS 104 fighting stick and enjoy this technical masterpiece of combos and counters. To this day, Virtua Fighter 2 is still one of my favourite go-to games for a quick slice of beat-em-up action. If you own the original PlayStation, no doubt you'll have enjoyed the original Tekken lineup, offering a familiar arcade experience. Toshinden was perhaps the game that broke the mould in what we now refer to as a weapons-based fighter, and a decent variation on the tried and tested martial arts formula. Toshinden had two things going for it. The ability to sidestep, earning it the somewhat contested title of first true 3D fighter on the system. Secondly, it had weapons. Yes, there was something in this formula. Personally, I tend to find YouTubers' memories a little rose-tinted when they are reviewing Toshinden. Even at the time, I found it a little jarring due to the frame rate, the movesets rather limited, and various exploit bugs in some of the final editions. Regardless of my less than stellar memories of the game, it did set a precedence for the genre, and subsequent editions of the game did improve it immensely. Over at Sega's AM2 team, there was not really much of a response. Virtua Fighter 2 still dominated the arcade and Saturn players' game libraries. The market was effectively full. Sega's AM2 division were riding high with fighters such as Virtua Fighter series, as well as Fighting Vipers and Fighters Megamix. In comparison, AM3 division had little in the way of a fighting game legacy. Sure, Radmobile was excellent, as well as the rest of their back catalogue such as Sega Rally, but there was no standout fighting game. That is perhaps outside of the 1996 release of Virtual On from AM3. which depending on how purist your view of game categorization is, would technically be classed as a mech-based fighter, as there is an emphasis on ranged weapons. Although this game certainly blurred the lines in its ability to also let you go one-on-one with hand-to-hand weapons. So, it was somewhat of a surprise when AM3 took on AM2 at their own game by producing Last Bronx. Now remember at the top of the episode, I suggested how the game fared poorly outside of Japan, but was received to critical acclaim within it. I'd like to open up the discussion to highlight why this game became a bit of a sleeper hit over time, and passed a lot of us Westerners by when it was first released. It all comes down to culture. In games such as Virtua Fighter, we had been conditioned as gamers to the arcade experience and expectations of a fighting game, a fun and engaging back and forth of throws, blocks and combos. This is of course nothing like a real fight. Most fights in real life would be considerably shorter. Last Bronx is very much a high stakes game of rock, paper, scissors. Blocking at the right time is absolutely essential to avoid one button presses that can take large chunks out of your health bar. Similarly, if you can get an air combo going, your opponent may not even have the chance to respond, depending on the difficulty setting. Everything from a traditional fighter is in here, it's just made more intense. Expect massive damage dealers. Mid-air combos. Technical blocks. And stunning grapples. So, you're going to need to decide. Are you more of a casual player, or someone that really has time to master the art of Last Bronx's no prisoners held approach to gameplay? If you only play this game for 5 minutes, you'll probably want to put it down and just write it off as another generic fighter. However, you'd be wrong to do so, as it's the journey to finding the game's depth that gives this game meaning. Of course, here in the West, we weren't told any of that, and the game was just released as seen. The culture of weapons-based fighters of this more tactical nature somehow got lost in translation as it exited Japan. Outside of the gameplay style, some of the cultural premise around Last Bronx was also lost in translation. You see, those stage locations, many are based on or at least inspired by real-life locations in Japan, primarily Tokyo. There's the 109 building, the Scramble Crossing in Shibuya, Haneda Airport, the Takashiba Ship Terminal, and of course Tokyo's Rainbow Bridge. Throw into this other identifiable locations such as the Tokyo Metro, and it soon becomes evident that this game was made for a Japanese audience, at least initially. It's this attention to realism that helps set Last Bronx apart from other games in similar genres. The cultural aspects of Last Bronx cut much deeper though. It's been widely accepted that Last Bronx was very much an occasion where art imitated life, in this case, the lost decade. For those that don't know, throughout the 1980s the Japanese economy was presented with serious challenges. This ultimately contributed and led to the recession of the early 90s. Low employment, a weak currency, and fewer prospects, particularly for the urban youth, led to the lost decade generation. It's clear to see this influence within Last Bronx's design. The game doesn't portray a futuristic apocalypse by any means, but it does have strong themes of a chaotic lifestyle for its protagonists, the decline of an older society, and certain change in cultural norms. This is reflected in the 90s style of counterculture clothing and backstories of the characters. Each fighter is from a rival gang and represents different interests and elements of society. Last Bronx does not hold back, with its desire to give a gritty commentary on Japanese society shifts within the 90s. Ask yourself, how many leading lesbian protagonists do you know in gaming? Possibly not many, and we're living in a society several decades after the release of Last Bronx. However, that's exactly what we got in Last Bronx. We get Nagi, who is the leader of an all-female gang, and the game makes no concessions in telling her story. Well played to Sega for portraying characters with various sexual orientations in a way that made us focus on the character, rather than using less subtle means of storytelling. Once again though, many elements of Japan's lost generation and counterculture empowerment just simply didn't click with many Western audiences at the time. This is a game that not only did a lot of us not appreciate at the time, we didn't even know why we didn't fully appreciate it. In terms of gameplay, there's a lot to shout about here outside of the difficulty level. For most, there will be a level of familiarity in the arcade mode of working your way through the various rivals. Expect all the common kick, punch, block, grapple and combo mechanics of a 90s fighter. Just be prepared to use more tactics than usual though, as a computer opponent can devastate you even on a default setting, should you overreach or not block effectively. You'll notice that the gameplay is at 60 frames per second, which is a real treat as the action really is silky smooth. This is of course essential, as it needs to be due to the timings of the blocking mechanics. In this respect, this actually outclasses Virtua Fighter 2 on the system. Despite both games utilising the high-res graphics mode of the Saturn, Virtua Fighter relies on an interlaced output method to achieve its 60 frames per second. Last Bronx can cope with a progressive output method while simultaneously adding texture mapping. You'll also see effects such as the weapon tracer and real-time shadow casting. Make no mistake, from a technical perspective, Last Bronx really does hit the spot. To boot, the sound design is fantastic, punches land with a satisfying sound, and the original soundtrack is outstanding. Fights feel tense, and the variation in weapon of your opponent will force you to learn more than a cheap combo here and there. As for the later stages, expect to be savagely beaten down if you're new to the game. Red Eye in particular will show you no mercy, as he will continually beat you down, strut around and laugh at you. When you finally take him down, you'll feel like you've earned it. Here in the UK and many other countries, we simply received a rather standard release of the game with a single disc. In my opinion, a release that was very much going through the motions in 1997, rather than the all-out launch that it could have been. Rather than focusing on the cultural elements of the game and what made it stand out, Sega dropped the ball in my opinion. First of all, the cover of the official Sega Saturn magazine with the tagline, "You want to play dirty." This is followed by the inside article featuring Nagi and the phrase, "Lock up your daughters." So okay, it's perhaps not the most wildly sexist thing you'll see in a games magazine, but it's frustrating that Sega UK really missed a trick here by not understanding that they had something special. Instead emphasising the more controversial lesbian character to bring attention to the game. You then read the column and you really do get down to the shocking mindset of the writer. Here is an extract from the article. With creations like Sakura in Street Fighter Alpha 2, we saw the advent of the schoolgirl Nika Flashing Machine. And if you think you can't top that, just get a load of Nagi Hojo from AN3's Last Bronx. With her black plastic jacket, midriff exposing crop top and tattered tights, she looks just a bit on the, dodgy side. But get this, Nagi is the first video game's homosexual, a lesbian no less. Cue gags along the lines of curing her from the male readership. Good grief, I mean, what was Sega thinking with this? Even at the time, this would have been offensive to many readers. Unfortunately, the article then continues with, "So, a mad, man-hating leader lesbian dressed like a hooker. Where can those wacky Japanese go from here? We don't know, but put it this way, we can't wait to find out." Overall, the article reads like a sexist and culturally offensive bingo game. Offensive to women? Check. Offensive to Japanese culture? Check. Offensive to gender equality? Check. Why not just add an upskirt picture of one of the women? I mean really, how little did Sega understand what made Last Bronx so groundbreaking in Japan? The message should have been 60 frames per second, unique combo system, real-world locations, and a Japanese arcade hit. Instead, we got this. I stand by my earlier comments. It's culture that polarised this game. Anyway, back to the Japanese release for some sanity. Japan received a rather decent double CD release of the game. As you open up the case, you'll realise that this is a very decent little package indeed. The case is simply packed with paperwork and extras for you to enjoy. There's the warranty card, the registration card, the spine card, various promotional materials, a really decent manual explaining the stages, the characters, the combo system, and everything you could possibly want to know to get you started. It's a really nice piece, and even if you aren't fluent in Japanese, the button configuration explanations and diagrams still make this a useful document. Then you get this little slice of arcade nostalgia, a move list wall chart. This is perhaps my favourite item in the package. The chart covers all of the fighters, their gang symbols, profile images, and does a really good job of getting you excited to fire up the game. It's small inclusions such as these that give the game substance. This wasn't just a run-of-the-mill release in Japan. Sega really invested their time and took care to get this product right. In essence, they knew who their audience were and catered to them perfectly. And of course on the other side, yes, it's a poster. Always appreciated. But the fun doesn't stop there. How about some glossy stickers to brighten up your day? Of course, we do then have to go back to the serious matter of the game discs themselves. Disc 1 contains the main meat of the action, essentially a disc containing the arcade, Saturn and various versus modes. Disc 2 is the special disc containing extended content, graphics and training tips. It's all animated in a chibi style, which is rather a cute decision to make considering the graphic nature of the main disc. In terms of the main disc, you'll find various difficulty settings to customise the game, but it's the arcade and Saturn modes that will keep you entertained for the most part. The arcade mode is very much as you would expect, following the flow and transitions of the arcade presentation. Saturn mode is virtually identical, save for additional taunting in between certain stages to develop the story, and also some rather well executed cutscenes. I must say that I had a lot of fun with Last Bronx as a game. It is most definitely an alternative to the other offerings on the system. It's tactical and challenging, but that leads to an intensity that simply isn't there with other fighting games. I'll have to admit that some of the cultural depth of the game passed me by back in 1997, but revisiting this game now, you realise how much the game had to offer, and it's no wonder that it was a smash hit in Japan. The worldwide release, and I do single out the UK here particularly, was just a terrible mistake and a mishandling of what is actually a game that needed less hype, if anything, rather than more. It's clear that even at the time, Last Bronx was a game that simply wasn't understood by many international gamers, and you can't blame the audience for that. Marketed as a piece of cheap titillation in the West compared to Japan's focus on deeper cultural meaning of the game, in hindsight it's no surprise that Sega actually marketed themselves out of sales through their mismanagement. Which is a shame, because in a sea of generic martial arts fighters, they really had something special here. Last Bronx is somewhat of a sophisticated fighting game, which is both its saving grace and its downfall for many. It's great if you can get into it, but simply quite inaccessible for some. Do I enjoy Last Bronx? Absolutely. It's filled with great character design, movesets, locations, and has an outstanding soundtrack. As to whether I can recommend Last Bronx to everyone is harder to answer. If you're after more of a casual arcade experience, I think that you can do better with one of the more mainstream AM2 catalogue. However, if you don't mind a bit of an alternative challenge for an afternoon of gameplay, Last Bronx might just be the fighting game of depth that you've been looking for. It's definitely a hidden gem for those that miss the 90s Sega fighting craze. Last Bronx may not be for everyone, but it is most definitely worth a play if you can track down a copy, and decide for yourself. Until next time, happy gaming. Hello again, I hope you enjoyed today's show and thank you for the view. Remember, you can always comment, like, subscribe and find us on the social media sites below. Happy collecting!